But now we're on the threshold of the land of Israel of full maturity, of a new generation, a more redemption-oriented generation. And if you haven't switched gears and you haven't reoriented yourself to educate the new generation, you belong in the desert, but you can't go into the land of Israel. This video was made possible through the kind support of my sponsors over at Patreon. Patreon is a great way to help independent creators like myself produce original content. If you'd like to get more English language videos from me, please consider becoming a supporter via Patreon. You can find the link in the description below. Thank you very much. So our topic for today is leadership and education, and more in particular, being sensitive to the changing atmosphere of a new generation. When a new generation comes along, you can't lead it and educate it and also parent it the way you could with the previous generation. Every generation has a different set of sensibilities and sensitivities, and it's different. And in many ways, people feel that every generation is worse than the previous generations. In fact, almost every generation feels that the next generation is worse off than its own generation. And that in many cases is, in many senses, it's true in the sense we have this concept in Judaism called Yeridat HaDorot, that as the generations advance, they're kind of deteriorating because we're getting farther and farther away from the original revelation of God on Mount Sinai and the original first generations of righteous Jews and righteous people who lived and prophets and so on. But there's another explanation that it's really the reverse, that every generation is internally more mature. It wants something more authentic and more profound, and it wouldn't settle for what previous generations settled for. And what appears on the surface to be an increase in, let's say, rebelliousness and maybe not heeding the truths and the wisdom of previous generations is on a deeper level. It comes from people simply wanting to not take things just based on believing other people and accepting authority. They want the fact that people are against authority today, that people are more, as I said, more rebellious and more questioning of accepted wisdom, is not because they are rebellious for the sake. It's not that they're rebellious for the sake of being rebellious, is that they want it to echo within them and they want to feel that it's true. It has to ring true for them. So people today are asking more questions, and they're more unsure of what it is that they were given, but not because the generations are deteriorating, because the other way around, the generations are becoming more and more closer to the future redemption, right? So on the superficial level, we're becoming more and more distant from the generations of old, those wise and righteous generations that were deeper than we are and more connected to the divine source than we are. But on an inner level, it's the other way around. On an inner level, every generation is closer to the generation of the coming of Mashiach, the coming of the Messiah, of redemption. So on a deeper level, every generation is closer to God in terms of the potential to learn and grow, but it has to come from a place that you identify with it. It makes sense to you, not just based on belief in some figure of authority. So that's the topic for today. The topic for today is what happens when the generations change, and when you need to come up with a new way of talking to the younger generation, a new way of teaching them, a new way of leading them, a new way of parenting them. How do we do this? And every generation is facing this, but it becomes more and more acute as the generations pass. And we actually see this, that in the 20th century and leading into the 21st century, the past 100 or so years, we see that the whole concept of a generation gap has become far more of a topic, far more demanding. There was always a generation gap, but as the world is becoming more intense and as technologies advancing more rapidly, then the difference in the how we grow up and how we deal with things and the amount of information that's coming into our heads is so radically different. Today, sociologists are talking about every 15 years, they're talking about a different generation. You had the baby boomers, then you had the X generation people, then you had the millennials, then you have the Gen Z people. And now the really young kids, they're calling them the alpha generation because they ran out of the alphabet letters. They started with X, then Y, then Z. So now they're going with alpha. It doesn't really matter the names. What matters is that it's that every 15 years you have to have a new name. And you have to have a new set of attributes, a new set of qualities that you're talking about, because reality is changing so rapidly, the generations are changing so rapidly, and we have to keep up. We have to change our tune and change the way we talk, change the way we approach things, change the way we expect the new people, the new generation to connect with the eternal truths of the Torah, with the eternal truths of divine wisdom, spiritual wisdom, etc. So the starting point for this class and what we want to use as a way of discussing this topic is we want to talk about a very special moment that happened during the 40 years of the Israelites in the wilderness. It was described in last week's Torah portion, last week's Parsha, we read on Shabbat, on Saturday. It's a pivotal moment, it's a pivotal story, and it's about what happened that caused Moshe, not to enter the promised land. What was it? What happened? It was his life's work, his life's project. He had the revelation at the burning bush. He was given the role of his life, the mission of his life. He needed to take the Jewish people, the Israelites, out of Egypt, and then he led them through the wilderness for 40 years. And then he reached the promised land, and he could stand on the mountain and look at the promised land, but he was not allowed to enter the promised land. And this has become a very basic image of the leader and the pioneer who's devoting his entire life to something and gets to the threshold, but isn't able to cross that threshold and is not allowed to see his life's work come into fruition. And Moses is the archetypal figure of this motif that we see in history. And that's why, for example, Martin Luther King quoted and referred to Moses. He said, "I may not live to see the vision that I had of social justice for blacks and for everyone come true, but I have seen the promised land, and I led you to the promised land." And of course, he was referring to Moses. So Moses is the archetypal figure. And the question is, why was Moses not allowed to enter the promised land? So the story begins a little bit before. It begins with Moses' older sister, Miriam, passing away. Miriam passed away. It's the 40th year of the wilderness. They're very close to the promised land. She was one of the three shepherds, as we call them. There was Moses and Aaron and Miriam, the three brothers, siblings, who led the Jewish people out of Egypt. And Miriam, who was there from the very beginning, who was singing alongside or repeating the song of Moses at the parting of the Red Sea, she passes away. And then something very interesting happens. The very next verse, we're told that the congregation had no water. Two apparently disconnected verses, disconnected stories. The first verse tells us, one verse tells us that Miriam passed away and was buried in the desert. Next verse, the congregation had no water. Now, this is a good chance to explain something very fundamental about the way Judaism works. And I'm saying this because I'm giving these classes. Most of the people coming into these Zoom classes, not all, but most are Jews. And I would say most of them are a little bit familiar, or more than a little bit familiar, with how the study of Torah works. But these classes also go to YouTube. And when they go to YouTube, and thank God they're reaching more and more people, and they're now getting thousands of views, and many of them are non-Jews and people with a Christian background. And I saw this very clearly the past week, because last week we didn't have a Zoom class, but I did upload a class that I gave at the US about there being another Eve in the Garden of Eden, a first Eve that preceded the Eve that we all know about, that's written about. And many, many people reacted, where are you taking this from? Where are you getting this from? This is pure invention. This has nothing to do with, we don't see any of this in the actual biblical story. And it appears like some fabrication. And so this made me realize something that we actually really need to dedicate a whole class or a series of classes to this. But I'm going to say something briefly, which is that many people are not aware of this, that Judaism isn't just based on the Bible. Because part of the tradition, the same tradition that gave us and gave the entire world the Bible, because the Bible didn't start with Christianity either. The Bible, I'm talking about the Hebrew Bible, the Tanakh. Christians got their Bible, or what they call the Old Testament, the Tanakh, the Hebrew Bible, they got it from the tradition of Jews passing this book from one generation to the other generation. But the same tradition that says that we got this book from through divine inspiration, the first part, the revelation to Moses, and the second part is the revelation to other prophets who lived after Moses, and then the third part is through divine inspiration to the writers and scribes who wrote the various books of the third part. And either way, it was all coming through some divine revelation, and it ended up being canonized into the book, the Hebrew Bible. But this same tradition also tells us that there was more wisdom that was given to Moses, and that was not to be written down. It was to be transmitted orally. And this is what we call, there's the written Torah, that's the Tanakh, that's the Hebrew Bible, and that's accessible via translation to everyone in the world. But there's also the oral Torah, and that was transmitted orally and only orally for hundreds and hundreds of years. That included extra pieces of information, extra stories, extra principles of what Judaism, what the Torah is all about. And even more than that, it included a set of interpretational tools, methods of how to read the books, the text of the Torah, and to discover all the many, many layers of meaning and layers of interpretation and facets of meaning, the different sides, different aspects of what it contains. Because it's not a regular text. It's a divine text. It has infinite wisdom encapsulated and folded within this text, the text of the Torah. So what happens is that Christians all over the world, they know the book that they call the Old Testament, but they're not aware of two very major things. The first is that when you're reading such a book, it's not just a novel or a play written by someone. This is a divine book. When you're reading it in translation, every book that's translated, you say, well, many things are lost in translation. This is an infinite amount of times more true of the Torah. The Torah, it's not just that some things got lost in translation, is that almost all of it is lost in translation. You get only the simplest and most shallow reading of the text, and the translator, there are many different translations, the translator has to choose out of a host of meanings for many, in fact, all of the verses can be read in a host of ways. So the first thing that Christians have is that they're reading the Hebrew Bible not in Hebrew. They're reading it through a translation, sometimes a translation of a translation, and that's a totally selective. It's like watching. It's far worse than seeing a black and white image of the rainbow. It's far, far more superficial than that. You're getting like a children's book version of the actual original text. So the first thing is, if you've only read the Hebrew Bible in a language that's not Hebrew, you have never read the Bible. You have never ever read it. You haven't seen a single verse, because you have to know the Hebrew in order to begin to appreciate the various different ways of reading each and every verse. So that's the concept called there are 70 faces to the Torah, that each verse can be read in at least 70 ways. It's a symbolic number. In fact, it's an infinite amount of faces to the Torah. And the second thing many Christians don't understand is that even if you would read the Hebrew Bible in Hebrew, and then you would begin to appreciate the depth and the layers of meaning, the different layers of meaning, you still need the oral Torah and the oral tradition. And the methods, the means, the interpretive tools that were given to Moses on Sinai and passed on to the prophets and passed on to the Jewish sages, and then the Jewish sages utilized them, and from that there was born the orchard. That's how it's described, this massive library that eventually it was written down, and it was permissible to write it down. It took hundreds of years. But once they could write it down, there's a plethora, a library, a massive library of books that expose the different layers and levels of meaning. And so the whole story about the first Eve, that's one example of this, but there's so many things. So now we're reaching another example. Because we talked about the fact that we had Miriam passing away, and the very next verse says that they didn't have any water. So if you're just reading a book and you think it's a regular book, you would say, okay, then it's like one chapter is over and a new chapter is beginning. The Torah told us one thing and it moves on to another thing. They're disconnected. But that's not how the sages were taught to read the Torah. They were taught that if you have two verses that don't seem to have any connection, the fact that they are adjacent, that one follows the other, must mean that you can learn from one verse about the other verse and the other way around. They teach one is adjacent to the other and bears upon the other. So from this, they learned something very, very, very important. They learned that just like the Torah tells us that throughout the 40 years of the wilderness, there was the miraculous manna bread that came down from heaven. And that was through the workings of Moses. Moses facilitated the giving of the manna bread, and it was through him, by virtue of his righteousness and his prophecy and so on, the Jewish people could be fed with the manna bread. So did his two siblings, Aaron and Miriam. Also, each one of them also gave a gift. That's the word that the sages use. There were 3 shepherds and 3 gifts, miraculous gifts that they bestowed upon the Jewish people. So Moses, his miraculous gift was the manna bread that we know about. But there were 2 more gifts. Aaron's gift is called the clouds of glory. These are the clouds that would protect and shelter the Jewish people from enemies, and they would help them get through the wilderness, and they would flatten the mountains so they could pass through the mountains, and things that you don't know about if you don't know the Oral Torah, but it's written in detail in the Oral Torah. But the topic for today, or what is vital to our topic, is the third gift, which is the gift of Miriam. And the sages learned about the gift of Miriam through these 2 verses being connected one to the other. Miriam passing away and the water stopping. And their explanation is that 40 years previously, when they left Egypt and they didn't have any water, famous story, Moses was told to take his staff and hit a rock that was in the desert, and water started flowing out from the rock. That happened 40 years previously. But the sages explain that this whole thing happened. This was the miraculous gift of Miriam. Miriam was the figure through whom, by virtue of whom, the rock was able to produce water. It was Moses who took the staff and hit the rock. But the fact that the rock could produce the water, that was Miriam's gift. And then they say something else. They say this rock didn't remain in that place outside of Egypt. The rock traveled with the Israelites. It would roll from one place to the other, and each time they would camp, the rock would also camp, and then would produce water again. And that was how they had water throughout the 40 years. Just like they had bread from the manna bread that Moses gave them, they had water from Miriam's well. It's called a well. It's not a regular well. It's not a hole in the ground. It's a rock that produces water. But this was how they had the water. Through Miriam, the rock would travel with them and produce water at each station. But when she passed away, the rock also disappeared. The rock was suddenly just looked like any other rock. And nobody could know which rock it was, and it couldn't produce water anymore. And that's why on the very next verse, people don't have water. It was a direct result of Miriam passing away. Miriam passed away, and immediately the rock who could work, the miracle could work through the presence of Miriam, it didn't work anymore. It became just a regular rock. And that's why they couldn't get water anymore. That's why they were thirsty. So what happens now? What happens now is that Moses and Aaron are helpless. They don't know what to do. It's not their work. It's not their job. It's not their expertise. Moses knows how to bring the manna bread. Aaron knows how to have those clouds of glory protect the Jewish people. They have no idea how to approach the rock, how to recognize the rock, how to make the rock flow with water. And of course, this is also a very symbolic image, right? A rock producing water, that's like taking the harshness of life and the rocky nature of the heart, maybe, and opening the heart. The heart is likened by the prophets in another place to when the heart hardens and isn't open to hearing the word of God or to being connected to the soul, it becomes a heart of stone. And it needs to turn into a heart of flesh. That's the expression that's used in Ezekiel. And so to produce water out of a rock is almost like opening someone's heart. When someone's heart has hardened, that's like a heart of stone. So that's what the stone is. Miriam could do it, but her two younger brothers, who are A, younger, and B, men. And that's something, it's more like an emotional intelligence that women are better at. So she had that. They don't have that. So what did they do? They start praying to God. And God tells them something very interesting. God tells Moses, take your staff, go to the rock, and speak to the rock. He doesn't tell him to hit the rock just like he did 40 years ago. He tells him to take the staff, but not to use it. To take the staff, but to talk, to speak with the rock, and the rock will produce water just like it did 40 years ago. And Moses and Aaron are given the power that Miriam had to produce water out of a rock. Problem? They don't know how to identify the rock. All the rocks look the same to them. It's the same kind of emotional intelligence of being tuned to even the inanimate level of reality, the inanimate matter, the stones, and seeing. It's like seeing that different students are different. Each student is different. And if you're not connected to the individual nature of the students, you would see a class and they all look the same to you. It's all little kids. So it's all rocks. And they need to reckon. They don't know how to do it. And they try talking. That's what the sages tell us. They try talking. They talk to one rock, talk to another rock, and it doesn't work. And then they get angry. And then Moses takes his staff and he hits one of the rocks because he's angry. He's talking to the rocks didn't work for him because he didn't talk to the right rock. What happens is that he does hit the right rock. And now the verse tells us that he hit the rock twice. Why twice? So the sages explain, the first time he hit it, the rock produced only a few drops of water. That was the right rock. It's the rock that can produce water. But he hit the rock, so the rock was unwilling to cooperate. It cooperated only a little bit, produced a few drops. Moses hit it again, and the water came out. So the problem was solved. The water came out. The people could drink. They were very happy. But there was a sin. Moses and Aaron sinned. They shouldn't have given up on the talking. They shouldn't have used the staff for hitting. They were told explicitly not to hit the rock, to speak to the rock. And because they got angry and impatient, and they're very clearly getting impatient with the Israelites, and they hit the rock, they were both punished that they cannot enter the promised land. They cannot enter the land of Canaan, which is to become the land of Israel. They can't. Now, you would say, what? That's all? That's it? That's all they did? So they made a little mistake They, instead of speaking to the rock, they hit the rock. And you can find so many alleviating circumstances because 40 years ago, it was okay to hit the rock. They remembered what they did 40 years ago. They took the staff, came to the rock, hit the same rock. They hit it, water came out. So you can really understand that they could make this mistake. In fact, there's another alleviating circumstance here. God explicitly told Moses to take the staff with him. That's almost like setting him up for failure. He told him to take the staff. He had the staff in his hand. It's so tempting, so easy to just hit the rock. And yet, because he did hit the rock and didn't only speak to the rock, then his life's work, he can't enjoy it. He can't go into the promised land, both him and Aaron. So, of course, it's much more deeper than that. What's happening here is that the rock is symbolic, as I said before, of the heart of the Israelites, of the Jewish people, of the congregation. And the Israelites are growing up. They're maturing. It's a new generation. In fact, we can point to 4 stages of development here, 4 stages of growth. First stage is when they were slaves in Egypt. That's like a fetus in the womb. Classical metaphor that Egypt is like a womb, the splitting of the Red Sea is like birth, and coming out of Egypt is the Jewish people being born. So it's at first in Egypt they're just in a womb. The beginning of the journey through the wilderness, that's childhood. The end of the journey through the wilderness, which is now, that's adolescence. That's why they're rebellious. And when they get to the land of Canaan, that's maturity. Right? So basically, Egypt is the womb, and the land of Israel, that's full maturity, and the desert, that's growing up. So the first years in the desert is you're a child, and as the years pass, you're growing up until you're reaching adolescence, and then you're on the verge of actually growing up, which is going into the land of Israel. So 40 years have passed, that's 40 years of growing up from a kid to almost an adult. And more than that, it's an actual new generation. Because the whole point of the reason it was 40 years, they didn't just wander, they weren't lost. They reached the land of Canaan very early on. The reason it was 40 years is because it was a punishment, because they listened to the 12 spies who told them that they can't conquer the land. And then they lost faith in God, believed the spies, and were punished that they would have to spend 40 years until the first generation, those who came out of Egypt, or anyone who wasn't a child when he came out of Egypt, they had to pass away in the desert, and you have to have a new generation that was either a child when they left Egypt, or they just totally grew up in the wilderness. And so that's what happened. 40 years ago, when he hit the rock, that was the Jewish people, the Israelites, were like children. And now it's a new generation born in the desert, ready to enter the land of Canaan, and it's more mature. And so the idea is very simple. The idea is that when they were children, it was okay to hit the rock. What does hitting the rock symbolize? It symbolizes discipline. Very simple. It's discipline. It's having punishments. It's having clear boundaries. It's having very clear what you can do, what you cannot do. That's how you raise a child. You tell the child very clearly, this is what you can do, this is what you can do. You're a child, we're the adult, we're the authority. It's an authoritarian form of education. You discipline the child. It's okay to discipline the child when they're a child. It was okay to hit the rock when the people of Israel were like little children, because hitting the rock symbolized having a very clear kind of authority figure and saying absolute truths, and that's what children need. But 40 years later, and the next generation that is now no longer freed slaves, but people who are more free, more independent, and they need to become even more independent because they have to go into the land of Israel and become fully independent. You can't just hit the rock. You can't just say, that's it, that's what you need to do. And if you don't do it, oy vavoy, we're going to punish you. Doesn't work. Try with teenagers and you'll see you'll see them, coming out the door the next day, the next instant. They're not going to listen to you. You have to talk to them. You have to convince them. You have to get their cooperation. You have to work with them. You can't just say you can't treat them like little kids. It's not true. It's not right. That's not the way it should be. It was okay 40 years ago, but look at me. I'm not a little kid anymore. I'm a teenager. I'm almost an adult. Treat me like an adult. Facilitate. Work with me. Explain what you're telling me to do, and then I can cooperate. I can cooperate with you. That's what the teenager is telling his adult figures. The teachers and the parents. So what Aaron and Moses did is, now we understand. They treated the Jewish people like it was 40 years ago, like they just left Egypt, and they were like little kids, and they needed to be shouted at, and they needed to hit the rock. And we see this not just by the fact that they hit the rock, but also by the fact that they were angry at the Jewish people, and they called them rebellious. And that's the worst thing you can do to a teenager. You're just rebelling. Now he's going to rebel even more. You have to work with them. You can't just call them rebellious. Now we have something else, by the way, which is totally lost in translation. You have to have the Hebrew to realize this beautiful, beautiful, subtle allusion that is hidden in the text. When they call the Israelites rebellious or rebels, they use the Hebrew word morim. There's more than one word. It could be mordim, but they say morim. It's written the way it's written. It's 4 letters. It's the exact same letters that make up the word in the same order. You just have to put the vowels in a different way. You read it in a different way. The punctuation marks. It's the same word when you just look at it without the little markings as Miriam. When they call them morim, rebels, rebellious children, you can see in front of your face the name of Miriam. And the illusion is that the Miriam, her absence is very, very felt here. Miriam would not have called them rebellious. Miriam would have been able to echo their rebelliousness in a good way. She wouldn't have said it in a way that's condescending or authoritarian, or that's looking at them from above. She would have used the same word, but she would have used it in a friendly way, and she would have worked with them. She had the emotional intelligence that they didn't have as much. And so when they said morim, you can, her name is reverberating, is present, but she's so, her presence is so, the lack of her presence is so felt here, then you miss her. You just wish that she was here. And so that's part of their mistake. So this is something very, very beautiful. And another beautiful Hebrew thing that we have here. What is the meaning of the word Moshe, Moses? And what is the meaning of the word Miriam? They have meanings. Moshe means to pull up or to pull out of something. He was called that way because the daughter of Pharaoh pulled him out of the water. When you pull something out of something, you're above that thing, you're holding it, and you're pulling it up. So Moshe is pulling up, especially out of water. So something is submerged, you take it and you pull it out. It's a one thing that you do, and you do it from standing above that thing. Miriam means to lift up or to raise up. It's not something you do standing on top of something. It's something you're standing with the thing or below the thing, and you're pushing it upwards. So Moses is coming with absolute, transcendent truth, spiritual, divine wisdom, and he's plopping it from above. And then he's pulling you out from the waters of this reality to the air of divine, absolute divine truth. Miriam is submerged with you in the waters of this world, in the bitter waters of this world, by the way, because Miriam also means bitter. And water is sometimes bitter, even salty, really salty is bitter. So she feels the bitterness, she empathizes with you. That's emotional intelligence. She is with us in our trouble, in our pain, and she lifts us up from below to above, not from above to below. Moses doesn't know this. Him and Aaron is joining him. He is coming from above and trying to pull them up. That's why he's shouting at them, saying, you're rebellious and angry and hitting the rock instead of talking to the rock. And now we understand why Moses and Aaron were not allowed to enter the land of Israel. The land of Israel is full maturity, even more than the final year in the desert. That's the transition from adolescence to actual maturity. And being connected to the land of Israel, being fully mature, fully independent, you can't just have a kind of parental or leadership authority that you had to the released slaves who just came out of bondage or were little kids. It doesn't work. The kind of leadership we need in the land of Israel, which is symbolic of the future generations. Each generation is closer to the future generation, the generations of the redemption. The leadership of redemption is not authoritarian. It doesn't hit the rock, it talks to the rock. It doesn't just plop down those transcendent truths and tells you need to submit to this truth. Why? Because I'm telling you, and I'm your teacher, I'm your rabbi, I'm the figure of authority, you have to believe me. It doesn't work. It doesn't work. You have to convince the new generation. You can't just tell them this is the way it is. We even see this in our generation, that we grew, those of us who are a little bit older, we grew up with very few TV channels. And there were news, and that was the news, you had to believe the news. Now it doesn't work because you have 1,000 channels and 1,000 YouTube channels. And people are more independent because they're learning and they're comparing what this channel says, what the other channel says. You don't have the luxury of one truth that's being, broadcast from one government that you have. Because then you have the one government, they have the official channel, but then you have 1,000 other channels. So people need convincing. They have to be convinced, and there's no way around it. You can't just tell them this is the only truth, because then you have 100 people telling that's not the truth. So the same, and it's even more than it's psychological. We have the generation is more free-minded, more free-spirited, and more independent. Has to accept what you're saying. So Moses and Aaron, if they haven't learned this throughout the 40 years, they can't enter the land of Israel. A new leadership is needed. Miriam was able to grow with the Israelites and could speak the language of the new generation, but she passed away. And now they had the challenge of trying to learn what she knew, and they weren't able to learn that. And so God is telling them, you were okay for the desert, but now we're on the threshold of the land of Israel, of full maturity, of a new generation, a more redemption-oriented generation. And if you haven't switched gears and you haven't, reoriented yourself to educate the new generation, you belong in the desert, but you can't go into the land of Israel. And in fact, there are 3 hints that although Miriam passed away, her spirit continued and did enter the land of Israel. And we don't have those hints regarding Moses and Aaron. What are the 3 hints? Hint number 1, there's a tradition that tells us that this well, this rock, this miraculous well that would roll from one place to the other and would produce water, although Miriam passed away in the desert and was buried in the desert, the rock continued. It came back to life in this story through the hitting, unfortunately the hitting and not the speaking, but it came back to life. But it continued and entered the land of Israel and then submerged itself in the water of the Sea of Galilee, the Kinneret. And it's there to this day. That's the tradition that we have. In fact, there's an amazing, beautiful story. Far later in history, 16th century, the holy Arizal, the greatest Kabbalist of the 16th century, he had a student. The student's name was Reb Chaim Vital. Reb Chaim Vital was not able to understand the teachings of his master, of the Ari, Rabbi Isaac Luria, the teacher. He couldn't understand. It was too complex, too dense. He wasn't able to understand it. What did the Arizal do? The Arizal took him. They went to Tiberias. He took a boat. They traveled to the middle of the Sea of Galilee. And then the Arizal stopped the boat and he said, now we're exactly above the well of Miriam. Took a cup, filled it with water, told his student, drink from this water. He drank from the water, And from that moment on, he was able to understand the teachings of his master, which is the teachings of Kabbalah, the inner wisdom of the Torah. So there's another connection is between Miriam and the inner teachings of the Torah, but that's a topic for another class. We have this tradition that the well of Miriam is in the land of Israel. Moses didn't come into the land of Israel. Aaron didn't come into the land of Israel. Miriam either. But neither did Miriam, but her well did. Second hint, although Miriam, we're told, passed away in the wilderness, was buried in the wilderness, there is another tradition that her grave was taken and moved and is also buried in Tiberias, Tveria. If you go to Tveria, there's a place there that there's a tradition, long centuries, that she's buried there, that her tomb was moved and she's buried there. And we don't have that tradition about Moses and Aaron. And finally, we do know for a fact that Miriam's husband was one of the only two people who came out of Egypt but entered the land of Israel. Those were Joshua, he's the protagonist of the book of Joshua, conquered the land of Israel, and Caleb. Caleb, the other spy who didn't sin and came into the land of Israel, is the husband of Miriam. So he sort of carried on her legacy, and he came into the land of Israel. And we don't have the tradition that the wives of Moses and Aaron came into the land of Israel. There is a tradition that just like Miriam, their tombs, their dwelling places were moved. They were moved, their bodies, and were buried next to Miriam, but not that they themselves came into the land of Israel. We do know that about Caleb. So there's just three little allusions that demonstrate that Miriam was tuned to the new mindset of how to educate the next generation. Now, I could end the class here, but we have to add yet another layer of meaning, another level to this whole story, which is really the most important thing of this entire class. Because what I just said is pretty much well known. I didn't invent any of this, and I didn't, I'm not inventing what I'm going to say now either, but it's something that's written many places. What I am going to add now isn't written in many places, and it's harder to realize. And that is the fact that, I'll do it through this way. When we're talking about our generation today, you could say, well, previous generations, they had a kind of authoritarian education. They had the teacher, and the teacher was all-knowing, and there was a lot of discipline. Sometimes they would hit the children in the classroom and so on. We don't have that anymore. We don't want it. We want a leadership and parentship and an educational system that is more respectful of the student and, doesn't hit the rock, but talks to the rock and so on. But you could say that in our generation, we have the opposite problem of what happened with Moses and Aaron on the threshold of the land of Israel. We have the opposite problem. Why? We now have a whole generation of teachers and parents and counselors and mental health experts who fully internalized everything we just spoke about. And they don't want to hit the rock. They only want to talk to the rock. And the problem is that they're only and always talking to the rock. Education has become too soft, too open, too democratic, too, accommodating of the little kid and the student. And what's happening today is that now you have a whole educational system and a parental system of basically telling the parents and the teachers, you have no authority over the child. The child and you are absolutely equal. And everything you must gain the cooperation of the child. Never tell the child what to do. Never tell them that there's anything absolute and true. Never give him absolute boundaries. Because then you could traumatize the child maybe. Because then, and remember, these are people, the teachers and the parents, grew up with a system that was too authoritarian. They went to the opposite extreme. And so now they're saying, we have to parent the kids, we have to teach the kids in a way that we always have to ask them, how are you feeling? And is this working for you? And, only suggesting that they would do something. You would never tell them to do anything. You can never tell them. And that has actually created, there's a whole book about this now, which you should read if you haven't read it, if you haven't heard about it. It's called Bad Therapy. And the woman who wrote this, is a journalist, and she did an amazing research. And basically what the book is telling us is that because of good intentions of many, many teachers and counselors and parents, that they try to raise a more happy and more connected, more psychologically connected generation, they went too far, far too far. And they created the problem that you have people with zero sense of adults who believe in them, that they could do, they can demand from themselves more than they believe they can demand from themselves. Because nobody told them you can do it, and nobody demanded anything, and nobody gave them anything absolute. They had no clear boundaries, absolute boundaries. They had no absolute values, and they were treated as if they were adults before they were adults. And so there's a whole bunch of problems there. So one problem is that when you always talk about how you're feeling and how you're doing and what your emotions are, and are you maybe feeling depressed or maybe feeling anxious, what happens is that the more you talk about this, they actually become more depressed and anxious. Instead of pulling them out of themselves and giving them roles and giving them things to do and telling them, that's it, that's what you work with, and pushing them forward into adulthood, they're constantly in therapy. They're constantly being talked to in a therapeutic language. And then she talks about what is called in medicine an iatrogenetic effect. Iatrogenesis is when the treatment makes the illness worse. So you have a lot of therapists and mental health experts who, by constantly talking to the rock, talking to the heart, only talking, without any kind of hitting. I'm not talking about a physical hitting, of course. I'm talking about there being discipline and authority and things that you have to accept, and you don't only choose them and you have to identify with them. No, you're being told that that's the way it is, and you have to work with this. So the fact that they're constantly reflecting upon their emotional and psychological state, that has created like an epidemic of more psychological issues and mental health problems. And they're increasing more and more. And the more there's therapy, the more it's increasing. And then there's more therapy. But it's not working because it's like a vortex of checking with yourself how you're feeling, instead of pulling yourself out into what we call choosing life and working with other people and doing good for other people. You're focused on yourself. Another thing that happens is that when the figure of authority is always asking the children how for their cooperation and not being authoritative, then they become very, very spoiled and very rude. And they're being told that they're just as important as the adults, and that they get it into their heads that they can do whatever they want. They demand very little of themselves. They're very, very rude to the adults, and you basically create little monsters. That's the bottom line of all of this. So the problem today is not that we're hitting the rock and not talking to the rock. The problem today is that we're only talking to the rock and not hitting the rock, or again saying absolute things and having authority, having discipline, and so on. So now that's the most beautiful thing. This solves the riddle, the biggest riddle of the story, which is, why did God tell Moses to take the staff with him when he went to talk to the rock? We said it's almost like setting him up for failure. I never noticed this until this year. If you want to go and talk to the rock, don't take the staff with you. Why take the staff? You just need to talk to the rock. But God explicitly told Moses, take the staff with you, but don't use it for hitting. Just stand with it and talk to the rock. The staff is vitally important. The lesson, what Moses needed to do, is not to stop being Moses, not having this more masculine or paternal form of education and putting all that aside and becoming a maternal figure like Miriam. The reason Miriam passed away is that Moses could combine his more paternal or patriarchal approach, the father's approach, with Miriam's maternal approach. He needed to speak to the rock. Everything we said before still stands. New generation, more mature generation. You can't just hit the rock. You have to speak. You have to convince. But he had to stand with the staff. And the staff symbolizes the absolute truths. You talk to the rock. You talk to the children. You talk to the congregation, to the new generation. But you're trying to get them to connect to a hierarchy of values that's divine in origin, that's absolutely true, and that we all need to submit to this. It's not some pluralistic, democratic, free-for-all game in which every opinion counts, and what I as a teacher or a parent is saying, and what you as a little kid are saying, it's absolutely equal. No. We're both looking up to the staff, to the divine truth. There's absolute values, but I'm not hitting you with the staff. I'm not just telling you that's the way it is. I'm talking you into, I'm trying to get you to see the truth of the staff. There's another beautiful Hebrew thing, and that's how we're ending this class. The Hebrew word for convincing, how do you say in Hebrew to convince? In Hebrew, the word is leshachnea. Shichnua is convincing. Leshachnea is to convince. What is the root? Every verb in Hebrew has a 3-letter root. What is the root of leshachnea? The root of leshachnea is kaf nun ayin, which is the same root as submitting someone. True convincing, proper convincing, is getting you to submit to something, not by submitting you or putting you down. That's for little kids. It's getting you to submit yourself to something higher. That's convincing. Convincing is I'm talking to you not as an authority, as a teacher, as a friend, as like an older brother, as someone who wants to help you, but not by telling you do whatever you want and do whatever you feel like and don't do anything that's uncomfortable or a little too hard for you. No. I'm trying to get you to connect to the staff. I want all of us to submit ourselves to a set of absolute values and divine truths and realize that they're true. And then climbing that ladder, climbing that staff towards the divine, towards the absolute. So that's a beautiful, beautiful explanation now we have of why God told Moses to take the staff, but to speak to the rock. That's the combination that we need. That's the leadership of every generation. We need more and more of this combination. It's a fine line to tread. It's not a simple balance, but that's the balance. We have to hold the staff, but speak. Speak in a way that's not imposing, but that it enables you to rise and accept this truth. And the failure of Moses was that he only used the staff and not enough the speaking. But the problem with Miriam was that she was only speaking and she didn't have a staff. And it's up to us, the generation that is entering the land of Israel, that is coming closer to the ideal of the redemption, to combine Moses and Miriam, Moses and Aaron and Miriam, and to have both of these, both sides of this truth. So may we all really merit to internalize this class, this teaching, be really, really connected to it, and realize that that's the only way to talk to the new generation, to talk to our own hearts, because we also have a heart of stone that we need to open it up and get water to come out of it. And we can't just use the staff because we're not little kids, but we can't also just softly speak to our own hearts And because then we would remain childish in comparison to the kind of maturity we need to get to. We need to hold the staff and speak to the heart, and water will come out of the heart, God willing. Hi everyone, if you enjoyed this episode, please press like, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment. If you want more English language videos from me, please consider becoming a supporter via Patreon. You can find the link in the description below. Thank you very much, and see you in the next episode.